Classical Rome does not follow on from Classical Greece. The two ran concurrently for close to 1,000 years, however each flourished at different periods. The high point for Classical Greek culture is considered 480 to 323 BC, followed by the Hellenistic period from 323 to 31st BC. The Roman Empire was at its most influential and extensive between 27 BC and 393 AD. By 31st BC, much of Greece was part of the Roman Empire. This was followed by the split between Eastern and Western Roman empires, with Greece being in the eastern half. Food for thought: how did Rome grow from a small village into the center of an enormous empire? And why was Rome so successful? There are links below you can refer to if you are interested in more extensive history about the Roman Empire. Roman writing, measurement, gods, currency, philosophy, literature, administration, education, art and architecture, all of these have Greek origins. Rome is situated in the region of cultural confluence via trade and settlement. It began as a city-state, then became a dominant influence locally, and then over a large part of the world. Rome, like ancient Greek cities, began with mythology. The following is an extract from the history of Rome, written by Titus Livius in 30th BC. After him reigns Proca. He begets Numita and Amulius. To Numita, his eldest son, he bequeaths the ancient kingdom of the Silvian family. But force prevailed more than the father's will or the respect due to seniority. For Amulius, having expelled his brother, seizes the kingdom. He adds crime to crime, murders his brother's male issue, and under pretense of doing his brother's daughter, Rhea Silvia, honor, having made her a Vestal virgin, by obliging her to perpetual virginity, he deprives her of all hopes of issue. But in my opinion, the origin of so great a city, and the establishment of an empire next in power to that of the gods, was due to the fates. The Vestal Rhea, being deflowered by force, when she had brought forth twins, declares Mars to be the father of her illegitimate offspring, either because she believed it to be so, or because of God was a more creditable author of her offense. But neither gods nor men protect her or her children from the king's cruelty. The priestess is bound and thrown into prison. The children he commands to be thrown into the current of the river. By some interposition of providence, the Tiber, having overflown its banks in stagnant pools, did not admit of any access to the regular bed of the river. But the bearers supposed that the infants could be drowned in waters, however still. Thus, as if they had effectually executed the king's orders, they exposed the boys in the nearest land flood, where now stands the Ficus Ruminalis. The country thereafter was then a vast wilderness. The tradition is that when the water subsiding had left the floating trough in which the children had been exposed on dry land, a thirsty she-wolf coming from neighboring mountains directed her course to the calls of the infants, and that she held them, her ducks to them with such gentleness that the keeper of the king's flock found her licking the boys with her tongue. It is said his name was Faustulus, and that they were carried by him to his homestead to be nursed by his wife, Laurentia. Some are of opinion that she was called Lupa amongst the shepherds, from her being a common prostitute, and that this gave rise to the surprising story. The children thus born and thus brought up, when arrived at the years of manhood, did not loiter away their time in tending to the folds or following the flocks, but roamed and hunted in forests. Having by this exercise improved their strength and courage, they not only encountered wild beasts, but even attacked robbers laden with plunder, and afterwards divided the spoils among the shepherds. And in company with this, the number of their young associates daily increasing, they carried on their business and their sports. Romulus and Remus, they were twins who were abandoned and suckled by a wolf. So the site of their abandonment and suckling by the wolf becomes Lupercal, a center of power in Rome. And the imperial palace is located on Palatine Hill, one of 7 hills of Rome. Rome's site is selected by augury, which means the interpretation of omens and signs. And some of the auspicious signs as seen by Romulus were a wall, birds, moats, the murder or sacrifice of Remus, and the favor of the gods. The rituals ensured appropriate founding and setting out of the city to ensure the gods blessed the site and that its founding was on a solid foundation, at least spiritually. Romulus was seen as the architect of Rome, and the beginning of Rome was captured in the book Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans or Parallel Lives, under the chapter The Life of Romulus in 2nd century AD. Romulus buried Remus together with his foster fathers in the Rimonia and then set himself to building his city. After summoning from Tuscany men who prescribed all the details in accordance with certain sacred ordinances and writings, and taught them to him as in religious rite. A circular trench was dug around what is now the Comitium, and in this were deposited the first fruit of all things, the use of which was sanctioned by custom as good and by nature as necessary. And finally, every man brought a small portion of the soil of his native land, and these were cast in amongst the first fruits and mingled with them. They called this the trench, as they do the heavens by the name of mundus. Then taking this as the center, they marked out the city in a circle round it. And the founder, having shod a plough with brazen ploughshare, and having yoked to it a bull and a cow, himself drove a deep furrow round the boundary lines. While those who followed after him had to turn the clods, which the plough threw up, inward towards the city, and suffer no cloth to lay turned outwards. With this line, they marked out the course of the wall, and it is called, by contraction, pomerium, that is post murum, meaning behind or next to the wall. And where they purposed to put in a gate, there they took the share out of the ground, lifted the plough over, and left a vacant space. And this is the reason why they regard all the wall as sacred, except the gates. But if they held the gates sacred, it would not be possible, without religious scruples, to bring into and send out of the city things which were necessary and yet unclean. The center and its peripheral of the city were set out in a ritual, in a symbolic manner. And the boundaries are drawn with walls being erected. And remember, the gates are not seen as part of the walls, but rather an omission of the walls. And they were necessary because the void allows the passage of things which were necessary, but not clean in their perspective. And all these operations rely on geometry and mathematics and numbers, which were cosmological rather than instrumental, because the importance is the harmony with the gods using the gods' own cosmological order. And the use of a sphere has implications to meanings such as planets, demigods, human head, soul, orbit, and the use of the cube has association with humankind, earth, and elemental shapes are used as well: fire, water, air, and earth. Everything is made of geometry and ordered by number. Proportions are numerical relationships. So this is Roman architecture, a geometrical order driven by cosmological order. And this forms the basis for Roman architectural theory as discussed by Vitruvius, who wrote an important text of architecture, De Architectura, at the end of the 1st century BC, and dedicated the text to Emperor Caesar Augustus. Why his writing was important? Because it was one of the earliest writing on the topic of architecture, and it remained influential and important for architects until 18th century AD. And Vitruvius was the key reference for Renaissance and classical revivalist architects. His text describes the training of an architect and the essential work of an architect over 10 books, each covering a different topic. So it's considerably broad and comprehensive because he was aiming at defining a complete system for architecture. So for Vitruvius, architecture was a combination of theory and practice. So understanding of the works and the ability to explain them, their proportions, technical accomplishments, and an expertise in construction and materials to be able to instruct others to build them. These are the topics covered in the 10 books of architecture. Book 1 covers education of an architect and studies of the site. Book 2 covers the origins of the dwelling house and materials. Book 3 concerns the temples and their proportions. Book 4 covers the origins of the orders and their classifications. Book 5 covers the public houses, for etc., the treasury, the theatre, basilica, and the baths. Book 6 covers private housing and determination of their styles. Book 7 focuses on building materials. Book 8 focuses on water. Book 9 focuses on astrology and sundials. Book 10 covers machines. On the education of an architect, Vitruvius states that these are the key skills that he must have. The literacy to record the works, and he must be able to draw, because the architect must represent the appearance of the work. He must be skilled in geometry, knows how to use lines, use directions with the aid of a compass, because he needs to prepare the drawings on site and he has to align it correctly in terms of the angle, the horizontals, and the verticals. He must understand optics to enable light to be drawn correctly from the well-defined areas of the sky. He must be skilled in arithmetic because it's a dollars and cents issue. He needs to calculate the cost of the building, apply measurement and laws of geometry. And it is true that it is by arithmetic that the total cost of building is calculated and measurements are computed. But the difficult questions involving symmetry are solved by means of geometrical theories and methods. So it's a very systematic approach to architecture. This rendering of the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, completed in 1490, is fundamentally different from others within the same period and preceding his time. It is different in two ways. The circle and the square overlay on top of each other to form one image. Leonardo's famous drawings of the Vitruvian proportions of a man's body, first standing, inscribed in a square, and then with feet and arms outspread, inscribed in a circle, provides an excellent early example of the way in which his studies of proportion fuse artistic and scientific objectives. Da Vinci, like Vitruvius, found a clear proportional and geometrical relationships between the universe and the human body. His understanding of classical rules of proportions and mathematics are clear in his drawings, and he often experiments with this in his works. The drawing aligns to an octagon, which serves as a geometrical framework for the proportions of the human body, and still holds up to Da Vinci's more modern medical and mathematical studies. The Vitruvian Man is one of the most well-known and easily recognized images of Renaissance art, and serves to showcase the blend of art and science which emerged during this period. While Da Vinci clearly references Vitruvius and uses his work as a basis for the Vitruvian Man, this sketch goes beyond the mathematical proportions of the human body. While Vitruvius considers the body as a source of architectural proportion, Da Vinci extended the observations and work by correlating the symmetry of human anatomy to the symmetry of the universe. In addition to the anatomical and artistic value of the Vitruvian Man drawing, mathematicians have studied the drawing extensively and found numerous proportional rules and formulas in Da Vinci's work. Cesare Cesarino's version from the 16th century shows an attempt to fuse Vitruvius' description with the cosmological and geometrical ideals. Unlike the more realistic proportions of Da Vinci's version, Cesarino's adheres to the classical understanding of the relationship between the microcosmos and the macrocosmos, which was so important for the Greek, Romans, and until the Renaissance. The precise center of the square and circle is the navel, mirroring the geocentric system of cosmology, not demolished fully until Galileo. The systems of proportion in Vitruvius' text continued to be influential for the next 2,000 years in architecture and are taught in architectural schools as a fundamental part of architectural education. Medieval and Renaissance architects identified the geometric relationship between the microcosmos and the macrocosmos as a reflection of the unique status of the human being as a temple of the Holy Spirit and emphasized the importance of the church as the body of Christ. Proportion, geometry, and measurement, these were key ways of expressing this understanding of the universe and of mankind's place within it. In ancient Rome, the education of the architect, these are very important knowledge and skills to have. Firstly, he must be versed in history, because in the design of a building, he has to use suitable ornaments and orders. So in order to use them effectively, he must understand the meaning behind them. And at the same time, he must be able to explain and to articulate why they are being used. He must be skilled in philosophy as well and develop a character which is flexible, fair, and trustworthy. And he must also know how to study nature and to understand the laws of nature. He must know music, because in knowing music, he understands harmonic relationships, he understands mathematical theory mixed with artistic and musical theories. And because music is an integral part of ancient Rome lifestyle, so practically he must know how to adjust and how to tune machines and how to design theaters to attune the sound in the theaters. He must know medicine, because with medicine he knows the climate and he's able to identify whether a certain building site is healthy or is infected, right? And water is very important for ancient Rome. So he must understand how the water flows through the site so as to build a healthy house. He must know law as well, because there are legal regulations for construction of buildings, party walls, eaves, sewers, windows, water pipes, so as to ensure there's no legal disputes, and he must draw up contracts with the employer and the contractor, similarly to what we have to do so nowadays. And he must understand astronomy as well. He must understand the cardinal directions and the principles governing the skies, the equinoxes, the solace, the courses of the stars and sundials, because these affect how well a building is designed and how well it functions. Food for thought. Question 1. What does your architectural education include? And why do you think you study those things? Question 2. How does your education compare with Vitruvius' recommendations? Question 3. What do you expect to be doing when you practice architecture? Next, we will look at the origins of architecture in Vitruvius' words. Vitruvius on the origins of architecture. The men of old were born like wild beasts in woods, caves, and groves, and lived on savage fares, meaning they are hunters, gatherers. As time went on, the thickly crowded trees in certain places, tossed by storms and winds, which caused them to rub their branches against one another, and this causing it to catch fire. And so the inhabitants of the space were put to flight, being terrified by the furious flame. After it subsided, they drew near, and observing that they were very comfortable standing before the warm fire, they put on the logs, and whilst thus keeping it alive, brought up other people to it, showing them by signs how much comfort they got from it. In that gathering of men, at a time where the utterance of sound was purely individual, meaning there is no common system of language, from daily habits they fixed upon articulate words just as those had happened to come. Then from indicating by name things in common use, the result was that in this chance way they began to talk, and thus originated conversation with one another. Therefore it was the discovery of fire that originally gave rise to the coming together of men, to the deliberative assembly, and to social intercourse. So here you can see the central role of fire in forming of the society and the forming of a common language. And so as they kept coming together in great numbers to one place, finding themselves naturally gifted beyond the other animals, in not being obliged to walk with faces to the ground, but upright and gazing upon the splendor of the starry firmament. And also in being able to do with ease whatever they chose to do with their hands and fingers, they began in that first assembly to construct shelters. Some made them of green boughs. Next, by observing the shelters of others and adding new details to their own inceptions, they constructed better and better kind of huts as time went on. Vitruvius' origin story outlines the theory and practice of architecture. It also establishes the philosophical basis for architecture as the right angle meeting the horizontal of Earth, connecting the starry firmament with human society and culture via mimetic geometry. Architecture as an act of craft creation is like a dance that interweaves cosmos into the fabric of the earth. Now that you have read Vitruvius' origin story, and you know his requirements for the education of an architect, do you see any overlaps in the areas of knowledge? The official founding of Rome was in around 750 BC with Romulus, who was like a mortal god, king, priest, hero. By 509 BC, Rome had become a republic, with a governing council rather than a monarchy led by a single king. Around the 4th century BC, Rome began to conquer nearby cities and expand its territory. By the mid-2nd century BC, Greece was under Roman control, and a century later, Rome was the center of a large empire. This empire brought relative stability, and as a consequence, prosperity, technical and artistic developments, and a wide trading network, which enabled the integration of a diversity of culture into the empire. The Roman Empire was never a cohesive, singular culture, though it centered economically and socially in Rome and the Roman administration. It remained culturally diverse, and local practices such as local gods were retained and incorporated into the Roman pantheon. Roman building types, construction methods, materials, architectural orders, and planning gave a visual unity to cities across the Roman Empire. Buildings such as baths, basilicas, amphitheaters, monuments such as statues of the emperor and triumphal arches, aqueducts, bridges, they were all similar across the empire. Many of these developed from Greek architecture, particularly temples and public buildings, while the Romans added new elements such as the arch, the apse, the domes, the semi-domes, and the vault. Some examples of the Roman building types: the basilicas, the baths, amphitheatres, theatre, and aqueduct. The domus, villa, triumphal arch, forum, temple. Basilicas were public buildings used for business, political, and legal matters. They are usually located on the forum and entered through the center of the long side. There is an apse end for the statue of the emperor, and there were use of vaults, arches, and porticos. Bathing played a major part in ancient Roman culture and society. It was one of the most common daily activities and was practiced across a wide variety of social classes. Though many contemporary cultures see bathing as a very private activity conducted in the home, bathing in Rome was a communal activity. Some of the earliest description of Western bathing practices came from Greece. The Greek began bathing regimens that formed the foundation for modern spa procedures. The Romans emulated them and surpassed the Greeks in the size of their baths. Public baths were not just seen as places to get clean, they also served as places to meet and socialize with friends, places to tap into local and city gossips, and places to get an athlete workout, and places to get warm in the winter. Rome had an extensive network of drains and sewers. Open gutters and sewers, for instance, ran down the middle and sides of some of the streets. Excess water from the aqueducts, wastewater from baths, and runoff water from local streams, these were used to flush the sewers and drains of Rome's. As in Greece, the Roman bath became a focal center for social and recreational activities. As the empire expanded, the idea of the bath spread to all parts of the Mediterranean and into regions of Europe and North Africa. With the construction of the aqueducts, the Romans now had enough water not only for domestic, agricultural, and industrial uses, they could only use it for their leisurely pursuits. The aqueducts provided water that was later heated for use in the baths. The layout of the Roman baths contained other architectural features to note. Because wealthy Romans brought slaves to attend to their bathing needs, the bathhouse usually has 3 entrances, one for men, one for women, and one for slaves. The preference for symmetry in Roman architecture usually meant a symmetrical facade. So even though the women's area was usually smaller than the men's area because of the fewer numbers of patrons, usually solid walls or placement on the opposite sides of the building separated the men's from the women's section. The bathhouses often contained a courtyard, which was an open-air garden used for exercise. Ancillary spaces in the bathhouse also housed food, perfume selling booths, libraries, reading rooms, and there are also stages to accommodate theatre and musical performances. Amphitheatres has an oval plan as a result of duplicating theatres joined by the stage. Its name showed it because it comes from a Greek word which means 2 theatres, amphi being 2 and theatros. It is not exactly like that because the result of 2 semicircular plans should be a circumference and not an oval shape. The fact that the idea was only changed in order to enlarge the area for performance, the arena. These buildings were never used for performing literary plays nor political speeches. They were rather used for spectacles like gladiators fighting against each other or against animals, or for simulation of battles. They were even used for performing naval fights, including the water inside. Supporting structures were solved as they did for theatres, sometimes a part of the front row laid on a slope and the rest on a structure of radial and circular vaulted walls. The exterior part was usually composed by an order of pillars or columns with arches, often blind. The amphitheatre was divided into 2 different areas, the arena, the stage, and the cambia rows. The Romans developed spectator sports beyond anything seen until then. The Greeks invented the Olympic Games, including the stadiums, but the Romans gave us the idea of mass entertainment. Though its origin is Greek, the Roman theatre has got a semi-circular plan instead of a circular one. This change was made in order to form just one structure between the scaena and rows. So the semicircular plan allows for a backdrop, most of the time is permanent. The Romans enjoyed many amenities for their day, including public toilets, underground sewage systems, fountains, and ornate public baths. None of these innovations would have been possible without the Roman aqueduct. First developed around 312 BC, these engineering marvels used gravity to transport water along stone, lead, and concrete pipelines into the city centers. The aqueducts liberated Roman cities from a reliance on nearby water supplies and proved priceless in promoting public health and sanitation. While the Romans did not invent the aqueduct, they used their mastery of civil engineering to perfect the process, including refining building materials such as concrete. Hundreds of aqueducts eventually sprang up throughout the empire, some of which transported water as far as 60 miles. The first of important structural considerations is their size, which is rendered particularly imposing by the regular archways, which is in some cases it reaches as high as 30 meters. The second is the precision required to maintain a constant downward slope and flow in the absence of pumps. Pumps existed, but they certainly weren't capable of handling the volumes of water in question. Excessive slope would mean sloshing water, and the lack of slope would mean points of stagnation. And the masonry used to construct the aqueducts could take many different forms, of which the principal ones were brick and mortar or stone. Local materials would be used wherever possible, and this implies a great variety of architectural results. The mortar itself was quick drying and was probably made of pure chalk rather than common lime mortar, which is slow to dry. Domus or house, these are urban dwelling units of upper classes. They come with an atrium space and courtyard space, and they use fresco, mosaic, and marble for inlay decoration. And there are villas outside the city walls. They are larger, more ornate, and spatially more complex than the domus. And the villas are usually local centers of power, both economic and social. The forums in Rome were central to public life, and they served the primary purpose of being marketplaces in large Roman towns and on major roads. The temples follow Greek precedents architecturally and functionally. They reinstate and affirm connections between humans and the gods. Greco-Roman building types, architectural elements, and the practice of architecture as a cosmological bridge became the foundation for architecture throughout the lands of the Roman Empire for the centuries after the end of the Roman Empire. The arch, the vault, and the dome are all applications of the same concept. The vault, or open-ended tunnel, is only an exceptionally deep arch. The dome is in fact a collection of arches, all sharing the same center. In each case, the pressure of gravity on the material forming the arch will hold it together, as long as the outward thrust is contained by the buttresses. The roof of the Pantheon in Rome is the most remarkable example of the Roman genius in the most impressive of architectural forms, the span of a huge dome. In the extra touch of flamboyance, the center of this one is open to the sky, a detail which adds no great architectural complication but provides a visual thrill, and the interior of the space is a perfect circle. The arch has greater capabilities than the lintel, for it can combine many smaller units to make a greater whole. In Greek architecture, a single vast stone lintel can reach between columns of at most 7 yards apart, whereas a Roman brick arch can span 50 yards. Arches were an architectural invention used throughout the Roman Empire, and they were used both for architectural design and support in many of ancient Rome's buildings and monuments. The most notable structure in Rome that used the arches were the Roman aqueduct systems, and they were also used to construct the famous Colosseum. Arches were used in Roman buildings because of their strength and support capabilities. They work because they are curved, which allows structures to pass weight from above down to the ground through the piers that support the arch. Additional rows of arch are vaults and barrel vaults. A vault is a long arch which makes massive structures possible, and this allowed the Romans to build massive buildings compared to traditional masonry techniques that were limited and not able to withstand the massive amount of weights. Barrel vaults were used in ancient Roman bathhouses because of their strength and structural properties. Unlike traditional masonry with timber roofing, these barrel vaults were more resistant to decay, to humidity, and the weather, which was ideal for the bathhouses during that time. Aside from incorporating arches for its structural properties, they were also used because of their beauty and architectural advantages. Ancient Romans used arch in many of their structures, but they did not invent them. They originally came from the Etruscans, which had a huge influence on Roman architecture, as well as many other aspects of Roman rule. The Etruscans were an early ancient civilization of ancient Italy around the area of Tuscany. Vitruvius, in his 10 books on architecture, distinguished different types of aggregate appropriate for the preparation of lime mortars. For structural mortars, he recommended pozzolana, which are volcanic sands from the sand-like beds of Pozzoli. There are two different types of color and tone: brownish yellow-gray in areas near Naples and reddish-brown in areas near Rome. He also specified a ratio of 1 part lime to 3 parts pozzolana for cements used in buildings, and 1 part lime to 2 part pulvis portiolanus for underwater work. And this is essentially the same ratio mix that is used today for concrete used at sea. And builders in Greek cities on the coast of Turkey evolved cement in about 200 BC as a structural material in place of weaker mortars such as gypsum plaster, which was used in Egypt, or bitumen. The secret of the new material is the lime, which binds sand, water, and clay. The Romans subsequently used finely ground volcanic lava in place of clay, deriving it mainly from the region of Pozzoli. Their cement, known for this reason as pozzolanic, is the strongest mortar in history until the development of Portland cement. When small fragments of volcanic rubble are included, the result is concrete, making possible the great arches and aqueducts. To conclude, we have an interesting exercise to try out. You may read Vitruvius' writing on proportions from the link below. Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 1 to 9. First, we draw the whole human body with the specified proportions. Then we draw the human face with the specified proportions. And after the first 2 steps, think, what numbers keep appearing over and over again? And why might these numbers be significant?